Good morning. My name is Claire Bentz. I am a first-year PhD student at Georgetown University looking at British and Spanish Empire in the Caribbean Atlantic in the 17th and 18th century. With me this morning, I have Professor Elizabeth Cross. Professor Cross is a historian of the late 18th century France and its empire with an emphasis on the history of political economy and capitalism. She earned her PhD at Harvard in 2017. After serving as an assistant professor at Florida State University, she joined the Georgetown faculty in 2018. Today we will be discussing her upcoming book, which is tentatively titled The French East India Company and the Politics of Commerce in the Revolutionary Era. So welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
How did you become interested in this topic of empire and looking at India and France specifically?
Great. Well, thanks again for having me, everyone. I guess to answer your question, I didn't set out to be a French imperial historian. That's the thing that you should all know at first. I didn't imagine that I would be a global historian or even a historian of empire, much less to be working on the Compagnie des Indes, or French East India Company. I started my graduate program with the idea that I was going to work on the political violence of the French Revolution in the Metropole. My early work was very much focused on the European War of 1792, France's relationship with Prussia and the German states, and I was very interested in questions of revolutionary radicalization, enemy language, both foreign and domestic. And that is where the Compagnie des Indes came in, because if you had asked me, 8 to 10 years ago, before I had even started this project, what my associations were with the Compagnie des Indes, I would have only been able to tell you one thing, and that's the fact that during the Revolutionary Terror, the Compagnie des Indes played this very cryptic role in one of the most important episodes of the Terror, the liquidation of the faction of the Dantonists in April of 1794. There were all of these mysterious allegations of bribery and corruption going on that were being used by the Committee of Public Safety to get rid of a faction that they regarded as challenging their rule. And it was from there that, as you saw for today, it's from that point that I start the book, and that was the point at which I started my own research, because that was a moment for me where I sort of saw a connection between the global and the metropolitan, and not even the metropolitan, but the Parisian politics of the terror, which was sort of my home base as a historian. And it was that point that I sort of used as a springboard to go off of, because I felt like that was a moment when questions of imperial governance, questions of corporations who are acting as transnational actors, was emerging in the course of the Revolutionary Terror, and I wanted to use that as a way to sort of take my own expertise in the French Revolution and begin to look outwards. So that's why I start the book with that anecdote, because it was really sort of my gateway into the project to begin with.
Yeah, awesome. I'm wondering too, I know this is your first book and it stemmed out of your dissertation at Harvard. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that process of taking something you've spent so long as a dissertation on and then transforming it into a book.
Yeah, well, I think I'll have a much better answer for that question in about a year, because I'm just really starting the submission process now. I'm still putting some work into the revisions before I send it off for peer review. So I don't really have much to say at this stage about what actually happens in the publication process. But I guess I would give sort of 2 points of advice about this process of converting the dissertation into a book. And one point of advice pertains to the dissertation side, and the other pertains to what you do after you graduate, after you defend. On the dissertation side, be as attentive as possible to the expectation that you are writing a book. It's never a problem to write a dissertation as a book. It's a very big problem to write a book as a dissertation. So when you're crafting the dissertation, spend a lot of time thinking about things like chapter structure, chapter length, introduction length. I knew people in graduate school who wrote 40-page introductions and chapters that were 100 pages double-spaced. no, don't do that. It's just going to make more work for you down the road. So think a lot about monograph models, especially first monograph models, that really speak to you, and try to map them onto your own work as much as possible, with the end target of the book being in mind. That said, on the flip side, except that even if you do all of that, still a lot of stuff is going to have to change. Dissertations always have to change when being turned into books. And when I think about the changes that I have undertaken with my project and am in the process of undertaking, I guess like what changed, both everything and nothing. So in a lot of respects, the chapter structure remained the same. It still sort of follows the same narrative arc. But within each of those separate chapters, a lot of different thematic and argumentative work changed, both in terms of adding additional research that wasn't available to me as a graduate student for whatever reason, and also in terms of just reframing the evidence that I already had. So I think a lot of people are sort of suffer from both the blessing and the curse that I had when I was writing my dissertation, which was that it was really an exercise in information management, that basically I found far more in the way of manuscript sources than I ever imagined that I would ever have access to. And really the process of writing the dissertation in many ways was just about wrangling all of those archival sources together into a narrative arc that made sense. And what that meant was that after I graduated, I had to go back and completely work at drawing the strength of the argument out of it. I had to work at sort of honing down exactly what I wanted to get out of each individual chapter and put it into dialogue with the whole of the book. And for me, that was sort of the key process of revision, that basically I needed to go back and really rethink the core arguments of the project. It wasn't quite as much about doing additional research, but a lot of people do add supplemental chapters or take their book in an entirely different direction. But for me, it was really about wrangling this embarrassment of riches together.
And that's, you mentioned just the change between when you were writing for the sake of writing a book versus writing your dissertation, and that more resources were available to you. As historians, when crafting narratives, we do have to make decisions about what sources we choose to include,
right,
what sources we don't. How did the sources that you found over the course of your research shape the narrative that you are crafting?
So the bulk of the research for this project was done in France, as you probably all saw. And what I ended up finding, as I mentioned, was really an unexpected trove of sources related specifically to this last incarnation of the Compagnie des Indes. So French historians have really long told themselves an archival story, a myth really, about the lack of sources around the three successive French East India Companies. You know, the Colbert Company's archives are virtually gone. The Law Company's archives still exist, but are kind of spread out in a lot of different collections and repositories, which makes them difficult to access. But the final company's papers are really actually quite consolidated in a manner that's almost reminiscent of what we think of with the British and Dutch East India Company. The British East India Company archives are maintained in a single collection at the BL, and the Dutch in The Hague. And what I ended up finding with this collection that I worked in primarily at the Archives Nationales d'Outre-mer was that basically this collection had that same kind of integrity to it, that same kind of comprehensive nature, but nobody ever knew about it really. It was transferred to the Colonial Archives some time ago, and nobody ever really made any note of the fact that it was transferred from Paris to the Colonial Archives. When I first went to the Colonial Archives, a mentor set up a meeting for me very graciously with one of the head archivists, and when I sat down and gave her the code, she didn't even know that they had it. And it was at that moment that I realized, okay, I'm really deep in the weeds on something, or I found something that's going to be really, really productive. And fortunately, it was the latter, and the immense richness of this collection led me in directions I could have never foreseen. So the chapter that you read today about India, the 3 case studies and the different comptoirs, when I set off on this project, I never really imagined that I would be able to really get at what the company was doing in India in quite such a substantial way. And it was something that was really opened up for me by the fact that there were all of these minute financial and correspondence records of what these agents were doing amongst themselves, with their British interlocutors and partners, and with their Indian interlocutors and partners. And that really pushed me outwards in terms of thinking about using other collections that I wouldn't have imagined would have been necessary at the outset of the project. You know, as a French historian, you think about using, you know, the national-based collections, but I ended up using collections in Britain very extensively, the India Office records and the Foreign Office records, when I realized that there were a lot of diplomatic ramifications to the project as well, which you guys didn't really see so much for today. And the other direction that I would say the collection really pushed me in was a direction towards financial history, which is also an angle that you didn't really see for today. Because another issue that people have often encountered when studying early modern corporations, and especially French ones, is a lack of information about how they were governed and who the shareholders actually were. And what I discovered in this series was that basically, unlike the previous two companies, this company did begin to keep shareholder records during the French Revolution, and not only records of who the shareholders were, but what their opinions of the revolution were. So I have one chapter that's about halfway built around the debate that the company really has with itself after 1789, where they're examining, you know, the changing political and imperial arena in which they are now a part, and thinking about how they can adapt their own institution accordingly. And moreover, it's also something that enables me, well, maybe not for this book project specifically, but eventually I want to do a project that sort of traces the prosopographies of all of the shareholders, because all of their names in 1792 and 1793 are recorded. And it would sort of give a picture of sort of where financial interests lay in the French Revolution. So this does these kinds of things. I mean, you make discoveries in the archives that you never really expect. And those two areas that really pushed me towards thinking more about what the company was doing in India, because as I said at the beginning, I was really coming at this from a metropolitan perspective. Both that and in terms of thinking about the financial history behind it. You have to roll with the punches when it comes to archival sources, because you never really know what you're going to find until you've found it.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to the way that it changed your approach, and just situating that within the current historiography on the Metropole and the colony. I'm wondering, how do you feel that focusing on something like the French East India Company, which is transnational, which is a non-state commercial actor, instead of focusing specifically on a nation state, how does that change your analysis of the relationship between the Metropole and the colony?
So I think it does it in two different ways. On the one hand, it's something that changes one's view of Metropole and colony and that binary, but it's also something that I think changes our view of the French Revolution. So starting with the Metropole colony binary, I would say that focusing on an institution like a transnational corporation breaks down that binary altogether. As I show throughout the project, and as you saw in the India chapter, there are these moments that are often thought of in sort of squarely metropolitan terms, like the Dutch crisis, for example. Who ever knew anything about this minor European diplomatic story of the late 1780s that had such deep financial ramifications for the way that France governed India in the late 18th century? The boundary between what is a metropolitan development and what's a colonial development really erodes when you think from the perspective of an actor that's embedded in both contexts, that's dealing with diplomacy in the Indian context simultaneously with diplomacy in the European, in the French context. So I would say that that's really the key richness that one gets out of thinking about an institution like this, that you really don't see those two things as separate, but rather fundamentally interrelated and constantly creating a feedback loop with one another. And on that point, I would say that focusing on an actor like this also really changes the way we think about major events like the French Revolution, which, as you mentioned, is really thought of in terms of the transformation of the nation state and the nation state model. And when we look at events like the Revolution from other perspectives, be they of transnational actors or be they of local communities or expatriate communities, we inevitably get a different view of what those events actually mean and what they changed. So yesterday we talked about how you guys recently read Hayden White in this class. And it brought back a memory of a conversation that I had when I was a doctoral student with a mentor about Hayden White and how I could sort of apply the thinking about meta-narratives to my own work. And basically we came to this conclusion, which was that the story of the French Revolution is usually told along two kinds of meta-narratives. One is the story of the fall of the old regime, the end of feudalism, the end of corporatism, the collapse of what was, or the making of the new, the making of the nation state, the making of modern political culture. My story, on the other hand, is sort of a rise and fall bell curve arc, that where 1789 is squarely in the middle. It's not the end point, it's not the beginning point, it's squarely in the middle. And I think that the value, well, at the time of this conversation, this mentor basically pointed out to me, how on earth are you going to get a project like this past the gatekeepers of the field? I'm still grappling with that one, but basically, I think that the value in using that kind of rise and fall meta-narrative to be talking about an event that's normally thought of in terms of ends and beginnings is that you see change and continuity very differently. And it's a story that allows us to think about continuities between the imperial realities faced by the old regime and by the new regime, by the corporate realities faced by the old regime and the new regime, that this company survived 1789 and restructures and could have potentially gone on to do other things if it had not been for this scandal during the terror that I mentioned that sort of puts an end to the whole experiment. So we need to use institutions like this to really think about change and continuity in different ways. I think that's really what they bring to the table.
Yeah, and you mentioned that changes how we approach nation states. Do you feel that changes how we approach sovereignty within the field too? Looking at just the power dynamic between France and India, or Britain and India, or even just the interplay and the collaboration and the competition between Britain and France in India, do you think that could have the potential to change the historiography that way too?
So I think it certainly complicates our notion of what empires look like on the ground. It certainly it makes it very difficult. I mean, one of the things that people always point out is that when we're thinking about French India, is it really an empire, effectively? Were there really colonies there? In the 18th century, people don't necessarily use the term colony to describe the French presence in India. And I think that when you're faced with an imperial actor like what the French are in India after 1763, you really have to think about what you mean by terms like sovereignty and empire, because it's not the same thing as when you're talking about the British Raj of the 19th century or French Algeria or French Saint-Domingue. It's a very different and much more dilute model of sovereignty along the lines of what people like Lauren Benton describe as being these sort of fluid models.
Okay. How would you situate your manuscript as well within current conversations on corporation? So we see the British East India Company, the Dutch East India Company. Where does your upcoming work on the French East India Company fall into that?
So I think my manuscript is a reminder of the importance to always read beyond your immediate field, which for me obviously was French history. And the conversation about French Empire really is very heavily dominated between these two 18th and 19th, 20th century poles. In the 18th century, talking largely about Saint-Domingue and the origins of the Haitian Revolution, and in the 19th and 20th centuries, talking about French Algeria and Indochina. And those models, while very, very useful, aren't entirely applicable to French India for the reasons that I just described. So basically, when I started working on the Compagnie des Indes, my instinct was to just start reading about how other historians of early modern trading corporations were proceeding. And what I found was that really for the last 15 or so years, British and Dutch scholars of the EIC and the VOC have really been seeking to reclaim the companies as sites of political discourse rather than just as economic actors. They're thinking in terms of the political negotiations that these companies undertook in the Indian Ocean arena with local powers, and the political relationships that they sustained within the metropole with ministers, with parliament, with their own sovereign structures. And basically, I was able to sort of draw that narrative into something that has been happening in French history, which is really the reclaiming of political economy as an arena for historians to investigate, one that's not restricted to quantitative thinking economic historians. And that literature, the combination of this sort of French political economy literature and this work on the notion of the EIC and the VOC as company states, in Phil Stern's term, really helped me focus in on a new way of thinking about the Compagnie des Indes. Because of course, I think we're a little bit over time, but to conclude, as I began the interview, I talked about the notion of scandal. And scandal and financial failure, bankruptcy, these are sort of the key attributes, I would say, of the histories of the three French East India companies in succession. But if we're evaluating them from a specifically empirical, quantitative perspective, that inevitably leads us to just want to talk about their financial problems. But if we bring in that political perspective, that notion of the company state, although I'm not sure that term fully applies to what I'm talking about, it allows you to get at a very different discursive lens for thinking about what these institutions actually were, who they were in dialogue with politically and diplomatically, and it allows us to really reclaim them as being parts of the history of the French Empire rather than, as Dana Agman so memorably puts it in her recent monograph, failures and thus insignificant. So that's where I think my work really sort of draws from those new approaches.
Awesome, and it seems like what you're doing is very exciting and is going to really contribute to the ongoing discussion. Thank you so much for chatting with us today.
Thank you for having me.